Abbotsford.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Speaker, and it's a pleasure to engage in this debate on the amendments to the Federal Sustainable Development Act, which is Bill C-57. And I believe that Canadians understand that when governments make policy decisions, they should be making those policy decisions through a lens that takes into account Canada's economic imperatives, our social imperatives, and our environmental imperatives. Now, the original act, as my colleague, the Minister, mentioned, was actually passed in the previous Parliament, actually a few parliaments ago, in 2008, under then Environment Minister John Baird. And as you know, in majority governments, opposition bills do not get passed. Opposition private members' bills do not get passed unless they have support in the government of the day. And of course, that's what happened here. Our government very quickly realized that sustainability had to be baked into everything that the federal government does, making sure we have the appropriate balance between the social, economic, and environmental factors within Canada. And so we supported that act. And of course, upon further reflection at committee recently, I'm a member of that committee, and I was very pleased to be part of the deliberations that gave rise to the report. And when we reflected back on the act as it presently stands, it had a number of failings, things that needed to be corrected. And actually, there was a consensus at committee on the items that needed to be corrected in that bill. And so we actually were able to issue a consensus report, which is not always that common when you have a majority government that is fixated upon imposing its will on this Parliament. But in that committee and in that study, we were able to achieve consensus. And of course, the Act itself requires that all government decision-making is done with a view to future generations. And I'm glad my colleague, the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development, actually recognized the fact that the recommendations coming out of the committee talked about the intergenerational nature of sustainability. What we're doing today in terms of policy making that will be viewed through a lens of the environment, the economy, and the social environment, that is about making sure not only that today's generation has a lifestyle that is one that we can applaud, but it's one that we can pass on to future generations that they can take up and build upon. A couple of the things that this bill does in amending the Act itself, it makes more robust the provisions that require government agencies and departments to provide regular reports on their progress in making sure that they meet our sustainability goals. The number of departments and agencies has been significantly increased. The number that are going to fall under this Act be subject to reviewing all policy making through the lens of the Sustainable Development Act. And beyond that, there's also an increase in the number of members of the Advisory Council that provides advice to the Minister. And there's also a number of items that we are likely going to ask for amendments on at committee. For example, that these Advisory Council members be paid. You know, every time Liberals come up with a new policy or a new piece of legislation, new regulation, they're always increasing the number of people that get paid. Yeah. And that costs taxpayers money. Yep. And one thing we as Conservatives can say with absolute conviction is that we've always defended the interests of Canadian taxpayers. And that's why we'll be making amendments at the committee. Yes. Now, Canadians also have the right to ask, well, okay, we've had this Federal Sustainable Development Act in place since 2008. So we're talking about close to 10 years. And we've had a federal government in place, a Liberal government now, for 2 years that has had the chance to understand the Act, to apply it across all agencies of government, to make sure that our sustainable development goals are met. So, what kind of progress has this government made, and has the minister made? Well, it just so happens that this week, when we're beginning debate on Bill C-57, that the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development issued what's effectively an audit report under the Auditor General of Canada, highlighting the performance of this government and this environment minister when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to the environment. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, this is a damning indictment of the Liberal government's performance, not only on the environment file, but on sustainability writ large. So let me go to the first report, and that addresses the progress that might have been made on reducing greenhouse gases. Remember, this is a government that boasted in the last election that it was the only party that could address Canada's climate change challenges. So they've had 2 years to work on it. You would imagine, with all the rhetoric we've heard from them and from the minister, that there would be significant progress made. So what's the conclusion of the Auditor General? Well, yeah, it's an F. It's a failing grade. She says, and I quote, "We concluded that Environment and Climate Change Canada, in working to collaboratively address the issue of climate change, the measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions contained in the plan had yet to be implemented." And it gets worse, Mr. Speaker. She goes on to say, "We concluded that Environment and Climate Change Canada," which is that minister's responsibility, "did not make progress toward meeting Canada's commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions."
It's a shame.
Now, with all the rhetoric we heard during the last election and over the last 2 years, and the minister always talking about the environment, the economy going hand in hand, you'd expect there would be some progress made. This report says no progress. It's not just that there was insufficient progress, not enough progress. The Auditor General says there was no progress made. Now that's pretty damning. In the meantime, of course, as my colleague reminds me, the one thing that the minister and her government did is impose a massive carbon tax on Canadians that is sucking the pockets of Canadian taxpayers dry. Well, it gets worse, Mr. Speaker. The second report that was issued this past Tuesday, page 27. "We concluded that Environment and Climate Change Canada did not provide adequate leadership to advance the federal government's adaptation to climate change impacts." It highlights a lack of federal leadership from this minister. It goes on to say most of the federal departments and agencies we examined did not take appropriate measures to adapt to climate change impacts. It goes on to say, as a result, the federal government could not demonstrate that it was making progress in adapting to a changing climate. Stronger federal leadership is needed. What a damning indictment of this Liberal government's and this minister's performance on the environment file. And so, Mr. Speaker, I believe Canadians can draw the conclusion that, in fact, this Liberal government cannot be trusted. And that would not be an unfair conclusion to make, because when you look at the government's record on other issues, it's very clear that this government that had made so many promises during the election, promise after promise, has now become a monument to broken promises. The last 2 years are littered with broken promises on deficits, for example. You remember Prime Minister saying, "Oh, we're just going to run $10 billion deficits." That was his word, and Canadians took him at his word, and they elected him. Today, we're looking at annual deficits of $30 billion a year. A huge broken promise. And these deficits are being run in order to Spend, 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 spend. Not on taxpayers, not on Canadians' priorities, but on the Liberal government's own priorities. Then we look at, remember electoral reform, Mr. Speaker? The promise that the last election was going to be the last election under the first-past-the-post system. Another broken promise. What a fiasco that was. And the minister lost her job as a result of that fiasco. But quite frankly, buck should stop at the Prime Minister's desk, because he was the one who initiated that failed process. He had promised Canadians he was going to consult broadly. This was going to be a fair process. We would divine some kind of a consensus out of that process and then move forward. Did that happen? No. It was a debacle. That's what it was. And at the end of the day, the Prime Minister said, oh, because I can't find consensus out there, I'm going to break that promise of electoral reform. It's a disgrace, Mr. Speaker. And then, of course, we get to the whole issue of taxes. Taxes here, taxes there. Carbon taxes, payroll taxes, and the most recent debacle that this government engaged in was bringing forward reforms that are going to impose a huge tax burden, not on the big fat cats, not on the rich people in Canada, but on small businesses. You're talking about mom and pop shops, the pizza owner in my community that employs his family, maybe some other employees, working hard to scrape by, earning maybe $50,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. The government has now determined they should be the target of tax increases. And these aren't tiny tax increases like those tiny deficits that the Prime Minister promised in the last election. He is proposing to tax these small businesses across Canada at a rate of 73%. Can you imagine that? It's disgraceful. They're going to take the revenues coming off savings that these businesses had, and they're going to tax those savings at 73%. And you know what? I have talked to businesses in my own community. I've held roundtables, unlike the NDP here. I've held roundtables on this tax, business tax. I can tell you my business friends, my business people, the ones who have the small business operations that are the backbone of our economy, they are outraged that this government, this Prime Minister, this Finance Minister would actually tax small business at a rate of up to 73%, but then the Finance Minister, who has a billion-dollar company called Morneau Chappelle, his company won't be impacted. He's going to pay lower taxes on $500 million worth of income every year. This is a company that's huge, one of Canada's largest companies. And then the Prime Minister, who has benefited from a trust fund, a family inheritance. His investments, his trust fund, won't be impacted by the changes that the Minister of Finance has brought forward. So again, a breach of trust. The government wants us to trust them when they say, hey, listen, Federal Sustainability Act, we want you to trust us on this. We're going to get it done. We promise Canadians we're going to protect the environment. We promise Canadians that the economy and the environment go hand in hand. You remember the Environment Minister saying that time and time again? She said it today again.
We'll hear it in question period.
And we'll probably hear it in question period. You're absolutely right. And you know what happened? Instead of understanding the economic component, this government has completely neglected our economy. The importance of small businesses across Canada. You know, Mr. Speaker, 98% of all businesses across Canada are small businesses. 98%. They're the backbone of our economy. And this Minister of Finance, aided and abetted by the Environment Minister, are actually attacking the very people that build our economy, that sustain our economy. Not only are they doing that, Mr. Speaker, this government is proposing to introduce tax laws that are going to make it more difficult for Canadian farmers and Canadian small businesses and the owners of those businesses to transfer their business to the next generation. That's why it's ironic to hear the minister talk about how important it is to look at the intergenerational impacts of our policies, right? Intergenerational impact. If she's talking about the Sustainable Development Act, which is supposed to marry the environment and the economy, why has our government completely forgotten about the economic component? Unbelievable, Mr. Speaker. You know, when we were elected, Mr. Speaker, we had predicted that the Prime Minister was making promises far beyond what he could deliver on. 100%. We knew that he was making promises that were raising expectations of Canadians. He would never meet those expectations. And guess what? We've been proven right. Day after day, there's a new fiasco, there's a new scandal, there's no transparency. Remember the mandate letters, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister issued to every single one of his ministers, including the Environment Minister. And I've read through that mandate letter many times, and I'm thankful to the Prime Minister for giving us a glimpse of what he was hoping to happen here in Canada and here in this House. And that mandate letter actually says that the Prime Minister wants to set a higher bar for transparency and openness of government, and set a higher bar for addressing conflicts of interest so that not even a perceived conflict of interest would be accepted by the Prime Minister. And yet we see with the Minister of Finance in his tax reforms attacking small Canadian businesses. He himself stands to benefit from changing tax laws, from forcing small Canadian companies to de-incorporate, which will now force those business people to invest in private pension funds, to have their pension funds administered by none other than, the Finance Minister's own company, Morneau Chappelle. You'll hear more about that in question period later, Mr. Speaker. The conflict of interest is so jaw-dropping, and it's so in conflict with that minister's mandate letter. And the same thing is true for the Environment Minister. Time and time again, I've requested from the Environment Minister that she provide me with departmental assessments of the impact that her carbon tax will have on Canada, including our small businesses, on families across this country. So, you know what they do? They hand us this information, but it's heavily redacted. And the word redacted, of course, means censored. This is a government of censorship. They do not want the public to know any information about the stuff that happens behind the scenes, behind closed doors. And so what we got from the minister wasn't a clear presentation of what the impacts will be on our economy. What we received was a heavily censored document that didn't help us make any kind of sense out of the government's policies. Now, we do have one report, and that is from the Conference Board of Canada, which came out with a report that showed that the carbon tax that the Liberals have proposed will have a modest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And when I say modest, you're right, I really mean negligible impact. Yep. But do you know what that report says? It's going to take, to implement the Liberal plan to address climate change, it's going to take trillions of dollars of investments. And the report goes even further, and it says, under the Liberal plan, what will happen is that government expenditures will grow. Again. And what will happen to the private sector? It says this very clearly. The private sector will shrink. Yep. Well, we as Conservatives, we have great confidence in the private sector. In our small businesses, medium-sized businesses, large businesses, they all contribute to the prosperity we have in this country. And to read in this report, a very credible report from the Conference Board of Canada, that in fact they expect that the role of government is going to expand in this country and that the role of the private sector is going to shrink is shocking. So, Mr. Speaker, I've put a lot on the plate here. The government has a lot to answer for. We can do better. And if they can't do it, they should step aside and let us do the job. Yay!
Questions and comments? Before we go to questions and comments, I just want to inform the honourable member that in looking at the clock. Out of the 10 minutes, he'll have about 8, and we'll continue after question period when this takes up again. Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
I just want to note that the member, his intervention had all the drama of a Shakespearean tragedy, but we're here to debate legislation. It's Bill C-57, so I have a very, very simple question. Does the honourable member support the bill at hand?
The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, simple answer, yes, we do, with amendments, which we hope to do at committee. However, she talks about a Shakespearean tragedy. This government's performance on the environment and on sustainability is a tragedy.
Yes.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague on the Environment Sustainable Development Committee for his speech, a little bit of which touched on the bill before us. It's a pleasure serving on the committee with him. We have a lot of fun together. We don't often agree, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a good time. I would like to hear from the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, given that his government actually shredded every federal environmental law that I worked for 40 years to develop, and given that the current Liberal government has broken its promise to move expeditiously to restore all of those shredded environmental laws, what does he think can be done to this bill that's before us to actually strengthen it? I know that there is a dilemma when there are certain changes that you want to make to bills, that there are limitations. I know that I wasn't on the committee yet when you reviewed the Sustainable Development Act, but I am well aware of what the report calls for. And it did call for some rather substantive changes to the bill, including shifting to a whole-of-government responsibility for reviewing whether or not all the departments and agencies are actually doing a sustainable development assessment of their policies, proposals, and laws. We know that the government is adding more government departments and agencies, but the Commissioner is essentially saying that's a pointless exercise if you don't actually make them do those assessments and provide those to the ministers and to the Cabinet. We note that the bill gives an option to the Treasury Board to provide direction on environmental impact of the proposals. But one of the main criticisms the Commissioner had of the current Act is that it's only limited to environment. It doesn't cover all the 17 sustainable development goals. So I wonder if the member could speak to what kind of reforms do you think is necessary to actually make the Sustainable Development Act deliver what it's supposed to?
The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank that member for her work on the committee. Yes, it's true. We seldom agree, but we do get along. And I would also note that that committee, in a parliament that can at times be quite fractious, especially with a majority government that likes to impose its will on the rest of the members in this House, I can tell you that at that committee, we do our best to achieve consensus. And out of the three reports main reports that this committee has issued, 2 of them were consensus reports where we agreed unanimously on the recommendations. So I don't know why the member is now criticizing the Act, because the Act does pick up on many of the themes that the report had raised, and it does it adequately. And I would note that, given the fact that the minister and her performance have been roundly criticized in the Auditor General's report, the Commissioner's report, one has to ask, if we impose more obligations on the minister, if she's incapable of complying with the current ones, how will she do so in the future? Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, hope runs eternal. It runs deep. So I'm hoping this government will make the changes that are required, reflected in that Auditor General's report, but the legislation before us does pick up on many of the recommendations that we made at committee, so we will be supporting it.
In comments, the honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has said that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. It seems like that they've gone hand in hand off the cliff since they took power. We're losing ground on both fronts, as the minister, as the member demonstrated in the report he talked about. We've seen this week showcase the disaster of this government's environmental policy. They've move time allocation on a bill to prevent the export of energy off our west coast, and they've overseen regulatory changes that have led to the rejection of a pipeline for exporting our oil off the east coast. The Minister for Democratic Reform said before the election that she wanted to, quote, landlock Alberta's tar sands. It seems like the government is, in fact, achieving that objective, and it's not going to help our environment because it's just simply going to mean more opportunity and expansion for foreign oil with a worse environmental record, and that doesn't benefit the Canadian economy. So could the member share a little bit more about why he thinks this government is proceeding in this disastrous direction that's bad for our economy and that's bad for the environment?
Great question.
Honourable member for Abbotsford.
That is a great question. In fact, we've wondered the same thing ourselves. I mentioned the small business tax. That's the first body blow that's been delivered by this Liberal government against small businesses. But now, this week, we find out that the Energy East project, which is a pipeline that would have connected Western oil in Canada to the East Coast so that we could be self-sufficient in oil, rather than importing from despot countries like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and Algeria. Why wouldn't we want to supply our own oil for the needs that we have? And I thank the member for raising this because it's another abject failure of this Liberal government. It goes on and on. Promise after promise, broken by this Prime Minister, broken by this Minister of Environment, broken by the Natural Resources Minister, who's waving at me, hoping he's going to get me off my game. Well, he's not going to get me off my game, Mr. Speaker. It's a disaster that's happening on the other side. And the media is finally picking up on that. So again, thank you for that question. I believe Canadians are looking for a change.
The Honourable